I'm Harper Bennett, 29, and at 2 in the morning, my mother's hand clamped around my arm, dragged me over the threshold, and let the door slam behind me as rain needled my bare feet. On the steps, Victor watched like a referee pleased with his call. She said, "Get out, and don't come back," each word hard enough to bruise, and for a beat I believed her more than I believed the roof above our porch. I stood there in thin pajamas, the street lamp pooling yellow light on the wet concrete, my breath white in the spring cold. I knocked once, then twice, and the deadbolt answered with a flat, final click. I walked to the sidewalk because there was nowhere else to stand, because dignity sometimes looks like not falling. I looked at the dark windows and said quietly that I would find out why they needed me gone so badly, and I promised myself I would not vanish no matter how tidy that would make their plans. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments and hit like and subscribe if you've ever had to hold your ground when someone tried to push you out. I was born on the cold side of Wisconsin wind and raised at a kitchen table where my father taught me to read a contract the way other kids were taught to read a map. He believed in clear terms, firm handshakes, and work that didn't need a spotlight to be good. My mother ran our home with lists and timers, measuring out kindness in neat portions, and when she laughed, it filled the hallway, but she wanted certainty more than anything else. Dad built Bennett Properties from a beat-up station wagon and a stack of index cards talking to owners after church mowing lawns when a tenant got sick and taking me along so I'd see how honesty travels farther than charm. We weren't rich when I was little. We were careful, and careful felt safe. When his business grew, the house got newer things, a sturdier table, the first flat screen on our block, but the rules stayed the same. Tell the truth. Know what you sign and show up for people who count on you. The first time I walked into a boardroom with him, I was 17 and trying not to stare at the glass walls that made everyone look important. He set a yellow pad in front of me and asked what I'd change in an addendum, and when I found a clause that punished a small contractor for being small, he smiled like the sun came out. By the time I finished college, I knew our portfolio as well as my own closet, what lots were worth holding, which leases needed a softer touch, which banks responded to data, and which to stories. I stayed in Madison because the city felt honest, its brick streets and weathered porches standing up to winter every year. I liked earning trust one meeting at a time, liked that our company could pay a plumber on Friday without calling in favors. When Dad's heart failed at 61, the world narrowed to a hospital room and then a will that named me as the person who would carry his work forward. I read it twice, then tucked it away like a compass you hope you'll never have to test. After the funeral, the house changed its shape. My mother moved a new chair into Dad's office and said it made the room brighter. Victor helped her hang framed photos from their trips, a lake in Michigan, a winery in Oregon, an evening in a hotel lobby where everyone looked expensive and no one looked like us. He used words like modernize and streamline about a place that grew by keeping promises, and people nodded because those words sound good when you haven't watched a roof leak at midnight. At the dining table, my regular seat slid 2 chairs down, then to the end, and eventually to the folding chair that came out only when company visited. I told myself furniture wasn't a verdict, just wood and fabric finding new arrangements. Some days I believed that. Some days I didn't. The distance didn't happen all at once. It arrived in polite emails I wasn't copied on in meeting times that shifted after I confirmed in a smiling, "Don't worry about it," when I asked to review quarterly statements I'd always reviewed. If I brought up Dad's letter, my mother said it was written when things were different, as if grief could rewrite a signature, as if intention expires like milk. Victor never raised his voice, and somehow that made it worse. He'd rest a hand on the back of my mother's chair during conversations and say that leadership meant making hard calls, then look at me as if I were another call to make. The company's website changed font and color palette first, then language, then history founded by a small team where my father's name used to stand by itself, and each edit felt like a quiet eraser passing over a line of my life. Money wasn't the point, not at first. It was the trust I could feel slipping, the sense that the ground under my feet belonged to someone else now, and I was expected to say thank you for the chance to stand there. I kept showing up because showing up is what I know how to do, and I filed reports and returned calls and watched signatures march across documents that should have waited for me. I reminded myself of Dad's voice when a clause sounded wrong in my head. I asked for backups of records and saved them in folders with plain names, thinking that prudence is not the same thing as suspicion. At night, I checked old emails and made sure I still had access to the account where Dad once wrote, "Ask the right questions, and you won't need to guess." On the night the rain came sideways across our porch, the argument wasn't loud. It was a steady push toward a door that shut as if it had been closing for months, and I understood that proof is sometimes the only language people hear. I walked 3 blocks to a bus shelter and curled in the plastic glow, listening to cars hiss past and trying to make sense of a mother who could lock her daughter out without a coat. My phone battery blinked at me like a metronome, counting down a song I didn't choose, and I charged it at a coffee shop when the sun came up, hands still shaking from cold, and something that felt like anger, but steadier. I scrolled through a page announcing Bennett Properties' new era, and my name was not there. Smiling faces were. The comments below used words like vision and fresh start, and I read them the way you listen through a closed door, catching only the parts that hurt. By noon, a message arrived from my cousin Megan with the time and address and 6 words that pulled the air from my lungs. "Family meeting, you should be there." I stared at the screen and pictured the room before I ever reached it. White tablecloths, measured voices, a chair at the end, waiting just for me. I pressed my lips together, finished my coffee, and stood. Because you go when you're called, even when the call doesn't sound like care. I folded Dad's letter back into my bag and stepped into the light on East Washington, knowing I would keep my promise to myself. And as the door of the restaurant swung open, I felt the air change like the moment before a storm breaks. The ivory room was all glass and gold light, one of those places where people whispered instead of speaking. I'd walked there from the coffee shop, still wearing yesterday's clothes, still tasting the bitterness of black coffee and rain. My stomach was a knot, my palms damp, but I pushed through the revolving door anyway. Inside, the air smelled like lemons and old money. Tables glowed under chandeliers, and the sound of silverware clicking filled the space. My family sat near the back faces I knew, but hadn't spoken to in months, maybe years. They looked up together like an audience waiting for a cue. Mom sat at the head of the table, spine straight, her hair pinned so tight it looked painful. Victor leaned beside her, one hand on her chair, the other resting easily on the table. Megan caught my eye from the far end and gave a small nod, though her face said nothing else. I slid into the nearest open seat and tried not to look like the person who had been thrown out of her house less than 12 hours ago. No one asked how I was. No one even moved a glass of water in my direction. Carol finally spoke, her voice carrying just enough to hush the room. "We're here to discuss your actions," she said. For a moment, I didn't understand what she meant. Then she continued, "We know you've been taking confidential documents from Bennett Properties, sneaking around accessing files you have no right to." The words came smooth rehearsed, as if she'd been practicing them in front of a mirror. A small gasp came from one of the cousins. Someone shifted their chair. My throat went dry. "That's not true," I said quietly. But she raised her hand like she was silencing a child. "You've betrayed this family," she said, and Victor's eyes stayed fixed on the tablecloth, unmoving, like a man waiting for a meeting to end. "After everything your father built, you'd risk it all for attention." The room blurred. The chandelier above us hummed faintly. For a moment, all I could hear was the sound of my heartbeat in my ears. "I've worked for that company since college," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Those files are mine to review. Dad made sure of that." Her mouth tightened. "Your father's gone. You answer to us now." I could feel every pair of eyes on me, curious, judgmental, maybe relieved that it wasn't their turn. Megan stared down at her napkin. No one else spoke. I realized then that this wasn't a conversation, it was a script, and my part was already written. I pushed back my chair, the sound scraping through the silence. "You're lying," I said. It came out sharper than I expected. Carol's expression didn't change. "Sit down, Harper," she said, her tone almost pitying. "You're embarrassing yourself." I looked at her, at the mother who had once bandaged scraped knees and waited up during thunderstorms, and saw someone I didn't recognize. I thought of my father's words from years ago. Sincerity is the one thing no one can take from you. I wasn't going to lose that, not here. "I'm done," I said, and turned toward the door. As I walked out, Victor finally looked up. His face was unreadable, almost detached. That quiet indifference stung more than all her accusations. Outside, the cool air hit my skin like a shock. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, the din of the restaurant muffled behind glass, and let my breath steady. The city around me kept moving, cars chatter, the smell of fresh bread from a bakery down the block, but everything inside me had gone still. They'd spent weeks, maybe months, painting me as a thief. I didn't know what they were hiding yet, but I knew one thing: people only lie that loudly when they're afraid of the truth. I walked without a plan, letting the streets decide where I went. Each step pulled me farther from that polished dining room, from their false smiles and tidy lies. The memory of Dad's office came to me, oak desk-framed photos of construction sites, the smell of sawdust and coffee. He had always said the company would be mine one day, that he trusted me to protect it. I whispered those words to myself as I walked. That night I stayed on a friend's couch. The ceiling fan hummed the kind of sound that usually puts you to sleep, but I couldn't rest. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my mother's face, the certainty, the calm cruelty. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, lighting up the dark room. An unfamiliar number flashed on the screen, followed by a short message, about Richard. I sat up, heart pounding, and opened it. The message was from Martin Cole, my father's old business partner, a man I hadn't seen since the funeral. It said only, "We should meet. I have something you need to see." I hesitated for a long time before replying. Part of me wanted to throw the phone aside, to stop digging into something that already hurt enough. But the other part, the part Dad raised, knew I couldn't walk away from answers. I texted back tomorrow morning, "Just tell me where." The next morning I arrived at a small cafe near the Capitol. The place smelled like roasted beans and paper cups. Martin sat in the corner, silver hair brushed neatly back, a heavy envelope on the table between us. He looked up, and for the first time in weeks, someone smiled at me without pretense. "I promised your father I'd keep these safe," he said, sliding the envelope across the table. "He would have wanted you to have them." Inside were papers, shareholder agreements, notarized signatures, the kind of legal language I'd grown up translating with Dad. My name appeared again and again, primary heir, majority owner. My hands trembled as I turned each page. Then I saw it, another document, a forged transfer routing those same shares to Victor Hayes. I felt the room tilt slightly. "How long have they been doing this?" I asked. "Since shortly after Richard passed," Martin said. His voice was low, heavy. I kept quiet as long as I could, but it's gone too far. I tucked the documents into my bag. "Thank you," I said. "You didn't have to get involved." He shook his head. "Your father believed in you. That's reason enough." When I left the cafe, the air outside felt sharper, cleaner. The street shimmered from last night's rain. For the first time since I'd been thrown out, I felt like I was standing on solid ground. I found a print shop a few blocks away and scanned every page, sending digital copies to Dana, my friend from law school, who now worked in corporate litigation. I called her right after and explained everything: the forged documents, the accusations, the meeting. She listened in silence, then said, "Send me everything. Don't delete a single file. If they've falsified transfers, there's a trail. We'll find it." Her calm steadied me. I followed her instructions, backing up every email, every image, every message that could prove what they'd done. I thought about my father's voice when I was little, telling me that truth has its own kind of patience. Maybe this was what he meant. That evening I sat by the window at my friend's apartment, watching the last light fade over the rooftops. My phone buzzed again, a new email from Martin. The subject line read, "Video." The message said only, "Be careful who you trust." Attached was a file. I hesitated, then pressed play. The video was grainy, black and white, from what looked like an office camera. My breath caught when I saw my mother standing beside Victor in Dad's old office. Her voice was sharp, impatient. "Once Harper's out, the shares are ours," she said. Victor nodded slowly, adding, "She'll never see it coming." I froze watching their faces, the easy way they spoke about removing me like I was a problem to be solved. The recording ended abruptly, leaving the screen black and the room suddenly too quiet. My hands shook as I replayed the last line again, just to be sure I hadn't imagined it. I forwarded the video to Dana right away. Within minutes, she called. "This is big," she said. "If it's authentic, it's enough to start proceedings. But we'll need to move carefully." I looked out at the city, the lights flickering in the windows across the street, and nodded even though she couldn't see me. I felt something settle in my chest. Not relief, not yet, but something close to certainty. The truth was finally starting to surface, and it was uglier than I'd imagined. But I wasn't afraid of it anymore. They'd wanted me gone, erased. Instead, they'd given me everything I needed to fight back. And as the rain began again, soft against the glass, I opened my laptop and started drafting an email that would change everything about Bennett Properties and about us. I didn't sleep that night. The glow from my laptop painted the room in silver light as I watched the same video again and again. My mother's voice, crisp and certain, filled the air. Victor's calm agreement followed like punctuation. It was all there, their plan to strip my father's company away from me, as if I were nothing but a name on paper. Each replay hit harder than the one before. Around 3 a.m, I finally shut the computer and sat still, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the faint patter of rain against the window. I realized there wasn't anyone left in that family I could trust. When dawn came, the apartment was quiet, except for the sound of my friend's dog pacing down the hall. I poured myself a cup of coffee and opened the folder where I'd stored everything Martin's documents, the video, and my father's last email. My name printed on those papers looked foreign now, like something I had to earn back. Dana's message came just after 7. "We'll move forward, but stay under the radar until we have every piece. They'll retaliate fast." I dressed quickly and walked to the small office she rented downtown. She looked up from her desk when I came in, her dark hair pulled back, glasses sliding down her nose. "You did the right thing saving all this," she said. Her tone was calm but firm, the kind that steadies you when you start to shake. She spread the documents across the table and began marking them with sticky notes, color-coded and precise. "This letter from your dad, the original signature alone, is strong. But the video, that's our leverage." I nodded, tracing the edge of a page with my finger. "They're not going to stop," I said. Dana looked up. "Then we don't stop either." We spent the rest of the morning cataloging every piece of evidence. She scanned digital backups, printed timestamps, and cross-checked signatures. By noon, the table was covered in papers and empty coffee cups. "We're building a timeline," she said, tapping her pen. "Everything needs to show intent. The forgery, the false accusations, this isn't just business fraud. It's personal misconduct." I sat back watching her work, grateful for the quiet competence she brought into a day that had started with chaos. My father had once said that truth doesn't shout. It just waits. Sitting there with Dana, I understood what he meant. That evening, after hours of sorting through files, I walked out into the cool air. Madison's downtown streets glowed under streetlights slick from another passing rain. I bought a sandwich from a deli and ate half of it on a park bench, trying to calm the knot in my chest. When I pulled out my phone, I saw the post my mother had uploaded that morning, a photo of her and Victor standing in the Bennett Properties boardroom. The caption read, "A new era begins." My name wasn't mentioned. The comments were full of congratulations. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was the way she'd rewritten the story, casting herself as the survivor who rebuilt the company after Dad's death while erasing the daughter he'd trusted most. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a call from Aunt Lorraine. I hadn't heard from her in years, not since Dad's funeral. I hesitated before answering. Her voice came through warm but wary. "Harper, I just saw the post," she said. "What's going on? Why weren't you in that photo?" I told her enough to make sense of it, but not enough to pull her into the storm. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. "Your father always said you had his backbone," she said finally. "If that's true, they're in more trouble than they think." Her words stayed with me long after we hung up. It was the first time in days that something felt like encouragement instead of advice. That night, I couldn't bring myself to go back to the apartment right away. I walked by the river, the water dark and restless under the bridge lights. My reflection wavered on the surface, thin and ghost-like, and I thought of the house I grew up in, the porch light that used to stay on until Dad came home from late meetings, the smell of his coffee in the mornings, the sound of his laughter echoing through the hall. It was strange how quickly those things could turn into memories you had to protect. By the time I reached the apartment, I knew I couldn't stay idle. I logged onto my father's old email again, hoping for more clues. Most of the folders were ordinary contracts, client notes, receipts, but one stood out. It was labeled simply, "For Harper." I opened it, my heart pounding. Inside was a single message dated 3 weeks before his death. It read, "If you're reading this, something has gone wrong. My shares in Bennett Properties are yours. Harper, don't let anyone tell you otherwise. The proof is in the safe at the office. Be careful who you trust." The message felt like a door opening in the dark. I printed it out, folded it carefully, and slipped it into my bag beside Martin's documents. If I was going to confront them, I needed to see that safe for myself. The next morning, I stood in front of Bennett Properties' downtown office for the first time since being kicked out. The building's glass facade reflected the cloudy sky, sharp and cold. I took a deep breath and walked inside. The receptionist looked startled when she saw me. "Ms. Bennett," she said quickly, glancing toward the hallway. "I wasn't told you were coming." "That's fine," I said softly. "I won't be long." I took the elevator to the top floor, the familiar ding of each passing level tightening my chest. When the doors opened, I saw my mother sitting behind my father's old desk. Victor stood near the window, arms crossed. She didn't look surprised to see me. "Harper," she said, her tone smooth, almost kind. "We were just talking about you." I stepped closer. "I'm sure you were," I said. She slid a document across the desk. "I want you to sign this. It transfers your shares officially to Victor. It's best for the company and for you." The paper was already dated, notarized, everything prepared. They'd assumed I would come. I looked down at the contract, then back at her. "Dad's letter says otherwise," I said. Her face paled slightly. "You had no right to access that account," she snapped. "I had every right," I said. "It was his gift to me." The room went quiet. Victor moved closer, his expression unreadable. "Enough, Harper," he said. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." I held his gaze. "You forged my father's signature. You both did, and I can prove it." Something flickered across his face, just a fraction of doubt or maybe fear. My mother's hand trembled against the edge of the desk. I turned toward the door, feeling her voice rise behind me. "You'll regret this." But I didn't look back. Outside, the sky had cleared and the air felt crisp against my skin. I walked until I reached the corner, then pulled out my phone and sent Dana a message. He tried to make me sign. "I have proof. Start the paperwork." Her reply came fast. "Understood. Keep everything safe. We'll move on it today." I leaned against a street lamp, the city spinning around me, cars passing, people talking, life going on as if nothing had changed. But everything had. I'd spent years living in the shadow of what they thought I was. Now I had the truth, and the truth had weight. Back at the apartment, I sat by the window and stared out over the rooftops. For the first time, I felt something steady beneath the fear. It wasn't peace exactly, it was resolve. They had taken everything they could, but they hadn't taken who I was. And when I opened my laptop again that night, ready to put the first pieces of my father's legacy back where they belonged, I realized I wasn't afraid of the fight anymore. It was already here. The next morning would bring more than just paperwork. It would bring consequences, ones they never expected. By Friday morning, the quiet of my apartment felt heavier than usual. I sat on the floor with my laptop open, surrounded by piles of documents that stretched across the rug, contracts, notarized agreements, screenshots of the video Martin had sent. The city outside was just waking up, but I'd been awake for hours, tracing through every signature and date until I could see their pattern. Every falsified transfer, every missing approval. They had built their lie carefully, line by line, and now the evidence was strong enough to tear it apart. I called Dana just after sunrise. "I found something else," I said when she picked up. "A letter Dad sent to me before he died, his signature, his words, everything." I heard her inhale sharply through the phone. "That seals it," she said. "We'll need to authenticate it, but it's exactly what we were missing." Her voice steadied me. "We'll move on this fast. But Harper, don't go near them again until we file. Promise me." I promised, though I knew I wouldn't keep it. There was something I needed to see for myself, and it was locked in my father's office at Bennett Properties. His email had mentioned a safe one that might still hold more proof. I waited until the end of the day when I knew the office would be quieter, then took the bus downtown. The lobby looked different now. New artwork, new carpet, the old receptionist replaced by a man I didn't know. He offered a polite smile, clearly uncertain who I was, but didn't stop me when I stepped into the elevator. My heart pounded as the numbers climbed toward the top floor. The doors opened to the familiar hallway where I'd spent most of my early 20s learning how to be my father's right hand. I expected the memories to comfort me, but they just reminded me how much had changed. When I reached the glass door marked Executive Suite, I paused. Through it, I could see my mother sitting at Dad's desk. She was alone, her shoulders perfectly straight, a stack of papers neatly aligned before her. The sight made me hesitate, but then I thought of Dad's words. "Be careful who you trust," and stepped inside. She looked up immediately. "Harper," she said, her voice calm, almost rehearsed. "I was wondering when you'd come back." "I'm not here to stay," I said quietly. "I need to see Dad's office. The original file's the safe." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Those documents aren't your concern anymore," she said, sliding a paper toward me. "Sign this and we can both move forward. Victor and I are trying to protect you from making a mistake." I picked up the contract without sitting down. The language was clean professional, too professional, a formal transfer of my ownership rights to Victor Hayes. I set it back on the desk. "This is fraud," I said evenly. "You know that." Her expression tightened. "You have no right to accuse me." "I have every right," I said. "Dad gave me his shares. I have his signed letter, his will, and the original agreements. You can't rewrite that." Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for the paper. "You had no business looking through his emails," she snapped, her voice cracking for the first time. "It was his account," I said, "and his company." The silence that followed felt endless. Victor appeared in the doorway, his face unreadable. "This doesn't have to be ugly," he said. "You can still walk away from this quietly." I looked at him, then back at her. "No," I said. "You can." For a long moment, none of us moved. Then I turned and walked toward the door. My mother's voice followed me, sharp and desperate. "You'll regret this, Harper." The sound echoed as I stepped into the hallway, but I didn't look back. Outside, the afternoon light hit my face, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel small. I pulled out my phone and texted Dana. "They tried to make me sign again." I refused. "I'm coming over." She responded almost instantly. "Good. Bring everything. We're filing first thing Monday." When I reached her office, she already had folders spread across the desk. "We'll submit the claim with the video. The forged transfer is your father's letter and Martin's testimony," she said, checking each item off her list. "Once it's public, they can't hide behind the company anymore." As she spoke, my phone buzzed again. It was an email from Martin. The subject line read, "One more thing." I opened it and my breath caught. There was a link inside. The message said, "Found this in Richard's old archives. It might help you understand everything. Be cautious." I clicked the link. A video began to load, grainy, time-stamped 2 months after my father's death. My mother stood in Dad's office again this time with Victor beside her. Their voices were low but clear. "Once Harper's out, the shares are ours," my mother said. "She won't see it coming," Victor replied. Dana leaned over my shoulder, her face tightening. "This is direct proof of intent," she said. "We can use this." The video ended abruptly, leaving the room silent. I stared at the frozen image on the screen, my chest tight. There it was, the confirmation of everything I'd suspected. Dana placed a hand on my arm. "We'll make this right," she said. "But you need to be ready. Once this goes public, they'll come after you in every way they can." I nodded, though my throat felt tight. "I've already lost everything else," I said quietly. "I can handle losing their approval." We spent the next few hours finalizing the timeline, attaching evidence, drafting the opening statement for the case. By the time we finished, the city outside had gone dark. I walked home under the streetlights, the cool air carrying the scent of rain. My mind kept circling back to the sound of my mother's voice on that video, the certainty, the ease. At my apartment, I sat by the window and watched the lights across the river. Somewhere out there, she was probably sitting beside Victor, convincing herself they were untouchable. But the walls they'd built around their lies were thinner than they thought. Before going to bed, I sent Dana one last message. "Tomorrow I'll post the truth. They can't silence me if everyone's watching." Her reply came a minute later. "Be careful, Harper. Once you post it, there's no turning back." I set the phone down and exhaled slowly. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance, low and steady, as if the sky itself was warning me. I knew what tomorrow would bring: chaos, headlines, confrontation, but it didn't matter anymore. The truth was on my side, and I wasn't hiding from it. When the first flash of lightning lit the horizon, I whispered to the empty room, "I'm ready, Dad." And with that, I closed the laptop, knowing that by the next sunrise, their secrets would no longer belong to them. By morning, the storm had passed, but the sky still looked bruised. I brewed coffee and opened my laptop, knowing what I was about to do couldn't be undone. Dana had texted me twice overnight, short, clear reminders to wait until she filed the first motions, but waiting felt impossible. My father's voice was all I could hear in my head. "Don't let fear decide what's fair." I logged into my account and began drafting the post. Each word had to tell the truth without anger or embellishment. I attached the shareholder agreements Martin had given me, my father's final letter, and the video of my mother and Victor in the office. I read it all one last time before hitting publish. The caption was simple: "This is the truth about Bennett Properties. My father's wishes were clear, and I won't let them be erased." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the notifications began. At first a few comments, then dozens, then hundreds. By the time I finished my second cup of coffee, the post had spread far beyond my own circle. Local business owners, former clients, even old employees of my father's company were sharing it. Some expressed shock, others anger, but most simply said what I'd been waiting to hear. "We believe you." My phone buzzed nonstop. Dana called first. "It's out there now," she said, her voice steady but urgent. "Expect backlash. They'll deny everything, maybe even threaten legal action. Don't engage. Let the evidence speak." I nodded, though my hands were shaking. "It already is," I said. An hour later, a news outlet picked up the story. The headline appeared on my screen like a lifeline: "Scandal Rocks Bennett Properties. Fraud allegations surface against company leadership." I stared at it for a long time before forwarding it to Dana. She responded immediately. "Perfect. Public exposure will force them to respond before they're ready." By early afternoon, I was sitting at the same coffee shop where Martin had first handed me the documents. The barista recognized me from the article and gave a small, uncertain smile. "Good luck," she whispered as she passed me my drink. I thanked her quietly and took a seat by the window. Outside, people hurried past in coats and umbrellas, unaware that the company whose buildings they walked by every day was beginning to crack. My phone vibrated again this time with messages from people I hadn't heard from in years. Former employees thanking me for standing up. Contractors who had been pushed out by Victor's modernization policies now offering to testify. Even one of my father's old clients wrote, "He'd be proud of you." The outpouring should have felt like relief. But what came next reminded me that every action has its echo. Around 6, the phone started ringing, first one call, then another, all from my mother's number. I silenced it. Then came the voicemails. "Harper," she said. On the first, her tone sharp and controlled. "You need to take that post down. You don't understand what you've started." On the second, her voice was different, tired, almost pleading. "We can fix this quietly. You're making a mistake." The third came from Victor. His words were clipped, his tone icy. "You've made this very public, Harper. You'll regret that." I deleted each one without listening twice. The truth was already out in the open. There was nothing left to hide behind. By the time night fell, the story had reached every major local outlet. The next morning, reporters camped outside Bennett Properties headquarters cameras, aimed at the glass entrance as employees filed in. I stayed inside watching from my apartment window the soft hum of the city beneath me. Dana called again just after sunrise. 3 major partners have suspended their contracts, she said, and the bank froze the company's main accounts pending review. We've hit them where it hurts. I closed my eyes, exhaling slowly. It's really happening, I said. It's just beginning, she replied. But you did the hardest part, telling the truth. By noon, another message came through, this one from Aunt Lorraine. It was short, but powerful. They're finally seeing who she is. Keep going. I spent that afternoon gathering everything Dana might need for the next step: emails, records, old statements. The evidence filled 2 flash drives and a stack of paper that nearly covered my kitchen table. Outside, snow had begun to fall lightly, dusting the rooftops, and for the first time in weeks, the quiet didn't feel heavy. That evening, I received a text from Owen Turn on Channel 4. I grabbed the remote and flipped on the TV. The evening news anchor stood in front of a photo of my parents, one from years ago, when the company had celebrated its 20th anniversary. The banner beneath read, "Bennett Properties under investigation for fraud." The anchor's voice was measured professional. She described the lawsuit filed that morning, the leaked documents, the viral video, and the company's financial accounts now under review. Then came a quote from my father, one they'd pulled from an old newspaper interview. "Trust is our currency. Without it, we have nothing." I set the remote down and stared at the screen. For a moment, it felt like he was there again, steady, patient, reminding me why all of this mattered. The next few days passed in a blur of calls and messages. Some were supportive, others hostile, but most were from reporters asking for interviews. I declined every one. The documents and the truth were enough. My voice didn't need to fill the silence. On Friday morning, Dana and I met in her office to finalize the next filing. She was smiling when I arrived. "They're folding faster than I expected," she said, sliding a paper toward me. "The board's collapsing. Several members just resigned. We're requesting an emergency hearing next week." I scanned the document and signed where she pointed. "What happens next?" "They'll either settle quietly or fight publicly," she said. "Either way, we're ready." Her calm made everything seem clearer. I realized then that fear had finally loosened its hold. I was still standing, still breathing, and the world hadn't ended. It was only beginning to make sense again. That evening, I walked down to the lake where my father used to take me as a kid. The water was still half frozen, the air biting against my cheeks. I pulled my coat tighter and watched the reflection of city lights ripple over the ice. Somewhere behind me, my phone buzzed again, another missed call from my mother. I didn't answer. For a long time, I just stood there listening to the wind move across the water. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but something inside me had shifted. The fear that had once kept me quiet was gone. I headed home through the quiet streets, the snow crunching beneath my boots. By the time I reached my building, I already knew what came next. Dana would handle the legal battle, but I had one more step of my own, a way to show that my father's company wasn't just surviving the storm, it was returning to the values he built it on. When I stepped inside, I opened my laptop and drafted a message to every client Bennett Properties had ever served. It began with the same words my father had written years ago: "Trust is our currency." As I hit send, I realized that tomorrow's sunrise would bring something new, not an ending, but the beginning of taking back what was rightfully ours. When dawn broke, the city felt different. The sidewalks were still slick from melted snow, but the air had that strange stillness that comes before something big. My post had gone viral overnight, thousands of shares, hundreds of messages, and more media requests than I could count. I hadn't slept much. Instead, I'd sat by the window watching the streetlights fade while the world caught up to the truth. By mid-morning, Dana called with news. "It's official," she said, her tone calm but charged. "The judge approved the preliminary hearing. We're moving forward with the injunction." I felt my chest tighten as I listened. That means Bennett Properties operations will be temporarily restricted until the case is resolved. They'll have to answer under oath. I pressed the phone to my ear, staring at the quiet street below. "How long until it's public?" "Less than an hour," she said. "Once it hits the docket, every paper in the state will know." That hour felt like a lifetime. I showered, dressed, and sat at the kitchen table, unable to eat. My phone buzzed constantly, texts from former employees, supportive comments from people I'd never met, and a handful of reporters waiting for a statement. But I didn't respond to any of them. I just waited for the story to break. When it did, it spread faster than I imagined. The headlines appeared everywhere at once: court freezes Bennett Properties accounts amid fraud allegations. The photo beneath was one I hadn't seen in years, my father shaking hands with a client, smiling the way he used to when business was good and people were honest. Within hours, calls were flooding in. Dana handled most of them, filtering out the noise, but one call she insisted I take came from Martin. His voice cracked as soon as I answered. "You did it, Harper," he said. "You brought the truth out into daylight. Richard would be proud." The words caught me off guard. I thanked him quietly and promised to keep him updated. When we hung up, I sat for a long time staring at the documents, still stacked neatly on the table. Pride wasn't what I felt. It was more like gravity, heavy, steady, unrelenting. That afternoon, I met Dana at the courthouse to sign the final submission. The marble floors echoed beneath our steps, and the air smelled faintly of paper and polish. She handed me a pen, and I signed each page carefully, my signature looping at the end, just like my father's. When I was done, she gathered the files, nodding once. "It's all on record now," she said. "They can't hide behind anything anymore." Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying the faint hum of traffic. As we walked toward the steps, a reporter called my name from across the street. Cameras flashed questions overlapping. "How do you feel? Will you reconcile with your family? What happens next?" I didn't stop walking. "No comment," I said softly, just as Dana had coached me. My voice didn't shake, and that felt like a victory all its own. That night, the fallout began. The first statement came from my mother. It was short and defensive, denying everything and accusing me of misunderstanding the complexities of business management. I watched the clip play on the evening news, her posture stiff, her words too rehearsed to believe. Then came the second statement, this time from Victor, insisting that the allegations were malicious and the company remained strong. But strength doesn't sound like panic. The next morning, half their board members resigned. Partners froze contracts. One of the banks released a statement confirming the account suspension. The house of cards was finally folding. I stayed quiet, just like Dana advised. Every time she called, her updates came faster, sharper. "We're gaining ground," she said one morning. "The judge requested the original shareholder agreements. We'll need you in court next week." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "I'll be ready." In the days leading up to the hearing, I tried to keep my mind steady. Owen came by one evening with takeout and 2 cups of coffee. He didn't say much, just sat across from me while I worked through the files again. When I finally looked up, he smiled gently. "You've been carrying this alone for a long time," he said. "You don't have to anymore." I didn't know what to say, so I just reached across the table and took his hand. The warmth steadied me more than any plan or document ever could. The night before court sleep didn't come easily. I lay awake listening to the wind against the window and thinking about the years I'd spent trying to please people who would never see me as enough. Somewhere in that thought, I realized the hearing wasn't just about the company. It was about finally letting go of that need to be accepted. The next morning, the courthouse was crowded. Cameras lined the steps, and I could feel the flashbulbs even with my eyes down. Inside the courtroom was cool and bright. My mother and Victor sat across the aisle, their lawyers whispering rapidly between them. When she saw me, her expression flickered something between disbelief and resentment, but she didn't speak. The judge entered and the room rose. When we sat again, Dana leaned toward me and whispered, "Just breathe." The proceedings began with the presentation of evidence: Martin's documents, my father's letter, and the video recording. Each piece built on the last, forming a story so clear even their attorneys couldn't interrupt it without sounding desperate. When the video played, the entire courtroom went still. My mother's voice echoed through the speakers, cold, unmistakable. "Once Harper's out, the shares are ours." When it ended, the silence stretched long enough to make the air feel thick. Victor shifted in his seat, but my mother didn't move. Dana stood, her voice measured. "Your Honor, the intent is evident. The plaintiff's rights were violated not by error, but by design." The judge nodded slowly, jotting something down. Then he looked over his glasses toward my mother's table. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, "do you wish to respond?" She hesitated, eyes darting toward Victor. When she finally spoke, her voice was faint. We were only trying to protect the company. The judge's tone didn't change, from whom no one answered. By the time the hearing adjourned, I felt drained. Reporters gathered outside again, but this time their questions carried a different tone, less curious, more certain. Dana squeezed my shoulder as we stepped onto the courthouse steps. "We've turned the corner," she said quietly. "They can't undo what's been proven." That night, I sat by the window with a cup of tea, watching the lights along the lake. My phone buzzed with messages, support from former colleagues, congratulations from clients who'd returned to the company, even a simple text from Aunt Lorraine that said, "Proud of you, sweetheart." I didn't reply right away. I just held the phone in my hands and let the quiet settle. Outside, the city glowed with a kind of calm that only comes after a storm. The fight wasn't over yet, but something inside me had already shifted. I wasn't chasing justice anymore. I was living it. And as I looked out into the night, I knew the next step wouldn't be about proving who I was to them. It would be about building what came next on my own terms. The morning of the final hearing arrived with a cold, bright sky. The air outside the courthouse carried that sharp winter quiet that makes every sound feel louder. Dana and I stood on the steps as reporters gathered at the bottom, their voices rising and falling in waves. I didn't look at them. My focus stayed on the building's tall doors and what waited inside. In the courtroom, the same judge presided, his tone as even as before. My mother sat beside Victor, their lawyers flanked by piles of papers that no longer meant much. Across the aisle, Dana arranged our folders in careful order. The hum of whispered conversation filled the space until the gavel struck. The proceedings began with the judge reviewing the evidence. The forged transfers, the notarized documents, the video my father's signed letter, they were all part of the official record now. The silence grew heavier with every item confirmed. When the judge finally looked up, he spoke slowly, each word deliberate. "The court finds in favor of the plaintiff, Harper Bennett. Control of Bennett Properties will be restored to her as the legal heir of Richard Bennett." For a moment, I couldn't move. It was Dana's quiet breath beside me that pulled me back. The gavel came down again, final and solid. Applause wasn't allowed, but the faint murmur of approval rippled through the back of the room anyway. Across the aisle, my mother's shoulders slumped, her hands trembling on the table. Victor stared at the floor. The judge continued ordering them to pay damages for fraud and falsified documentation. $250,000. The number barely registered. It wasn't about money anymore. It was about truth being written down where no one could erase it. When the hearing ended, Dana gathered the files, her smile, calm but fierce. "It's done," she whispered. "You've got your father's company back." Outside, the reporters swarmed again, their cameras flashing as we stepped into the sunlight. Dana gave a short statement, but I kept walking, my breath fogging in the cold air. For the first time in years, the company's future wasn't hanging in someone else's hands. That evening I sat in my apartment, surrounded by boxes of documents that would soon return to Bennett Properties. My phone buzzed with messages. Congratulations from old clients, messages from employees who wanted to return, even notes from people who'd followed the story online. But one call stood out. My mother. She called 3 times in a row, and each time I let it ring. When the 4th came, I almost turned the phone off, but something made me listen to the voicemail instead. Her voice was shaky, stripped of its practiced calm. "Harper, please," she said. "I know I can't undo it, but we need to talk. I'm sorry." There was a long pause before she added, "You sound so much like your father when you speak now." Then the line went dead. I sat there for a long while, staring at the phone. The woman who had once dragged me out of my childhood home in the rain was now asking to be heard, but apologies like trust only mattered when they came before the damage was done. I deleted the message. The next day, local news stations aired the story again, this time with new headlines, "Court Restores Bennett Properties to Founder's Daughter." The photo that ran alongside showed me leaving the courthouse, the wind catching my hair. I hadn't realized anyone had taken it. Dana called later that morning. "They're not appealing," she said. Victor's lawyer filed the withdrawal. The relief in her voice carried through the phone. "They're finished, Harper. Completely. It didn't feel like triumph, just quiet resolution, the kind that comes after too many sleepless nights. I thanked her and promised to stop by the office later to finalize the paperwork. When I returned to Bennett Properties a few days later, the air inside felt different. The lobby was busy again, employees greeting one another, phones ringing, the rhythm of work returning. Several faces lit up when I walked in. I nodded in thanks, still adjusting to the idea of belonging there again. In the boardroom upstairs, I met with department heads, most of whom had stayed loyal even during the chaos. "We're going back to what this company was built on," I told them. "Transparency, integrity, community partnerships. The same values my father started with." Heads nodded around the table, and I saw the weight lift from their shoulders. Over the following weeks, I met with every major client personally, assuring them the company was stable and moving forward. Some meetings were short, others emotional, but each ended the same with a handshake and renewed trust. Victor and my mother faded from the headlines soon after. Reports surfaced that several business partners had cut ties with them, and whispers of an investigation began circulating. I didn't follow the details. It wasn't my story to track anymore. One afternoon, Dana and I sat together in my father's old office, now restored to the way he'd kept it. His framed photo stood on the corner of the desk, sunlight glinting off the glass. "You've done more than win a case," Dana said quietly. "You rebuilt something worth keeping." I looked at the desk, at the small plaque that still read Richard Bennett, founder, and nodded. It was never just mine to save. The weeks that followed passed quickly. The company accounts were released, projects restarted, and employees returned. The legal paperwork was finally settled, and I officially signed as CEO. My signature felt steady, this time unshaken. The night the settlement cleared, I met Owen at Tenney Park, the same place we used to walk when I needed to clear my head. The lake was half frozen, the reflection of streetlights stretching across the ice. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. He opened it without saying a word. Inside was a simple gold ring, elegant and modest, the kind my father would have approved of. "Will you marry me?" he asked. For the first time in what felt like years, my heart felt light. I nodded, unable to speak. We married quietly a few weeks later under the same trees by the lake, surrounded by people who had stood beside me through everything: Dana Martin, Aunt Lorraine, and a handful of close friends. The ceremony was simple but full of warmth. As I said my vows, the wind rustled through the branches, and it felt like my father was there too, watching with quiet pride. After the ceremony, Aunt Lorraine read a few lines from a poem she'd written for my father years ago. Her voice trembled as she said, "He built more than a company. He built a compass." I held Owen's hand, tears stinging my eyes. The reception was small, filled with laughter and the kind of peace that comes when you stop running from the past. Dana raised her glass halfway through and said, "To the truth, it always finds its way home." Everyone lifted their glasses, and I felt the moment settle deep in my chest. Later that night, as the guests drifted away and the lights dimmed, I looked out over the lake again. The company was mine now, but more importantly, so was my life. The battles, the losses, the years of doubt, they'd all led here to a quiet kind of freedom my father would have recognized. The weeks after the wedding passed softly, like the world had decided to take a breath with me. I'd wake early, open the blinds, and let the morning light spill across the same desk where my father once worked. Bennett Properties had become steady again, projects running smoothly, partners, returning employees walking the halls with purpose instead of worry. It wasn't flashy success, but quiet stability, and that felt truer to what he built. Most days I still caught myself pausing by the framed photo of him in the corner. His smile in that picture reminded me that strength didn't always come from loud victories. Sometimes it came from simply showing up again and again until something good took root. Dana and I met every Monday to review progress. She always arrived with a notebook full of tasks and left me with a list that stretched long into the week. "You're rebuilding the right way," she told me once as she packed up her papers. "Not just the company, your life too." I smiled at that because she was right. Owen and I settled into a rhythm that was both new and familiar. Evenings were spent in the small house we'd found near the lake, where the windows framed the water and the seasons shifted in quiet color. Some nights we'd walk the shoreline in silence, hand in hand, and I'd think about how much had changed since the night I stood barefoot in the rain with nowhere to go. Back then, everything I loved felt out of reach. Now I understood that losing everything had only made space for what was real. My mother never called again. Word reached me through relatives that she and Victor had left Madison selling their house and trying to start over somewhere else. There were rumors about ongoing investigations and debts, but I didn't follow the details. I didn't need to. Whatever consequences came would come without me. The anger had burned out long before leaving something quieter in its place. Not forgiveness exactly, but peace. One afternoon, I visited my father's grave for the first time since the trial ended. The air was cool and still, and the branches above swayed gently against the sky. I brushed a few leaves from his headstone and placed a small white flower beside it. "We're all right now," I said. My voice didn't shake. "Your company's in good hands." I sat there for a while talking softly about the people who had stayed the changes we'd made and the way the city was beginning to trust the Bennett name again. It felt less like a goodbye and more like a conversation that had simply paused for a few years. A few weeks later, we hosted a small gathering at the company's headquarters, nothing formal, just a quiet celebration for the team that had stood by me through everything. Martin gave a short speech about Richard's legacy, and when he mentioned my name, his eyes glistened. Harper didn't just defend her inheritance, he said. She honored the values that built it. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded and lifted my glass. That night, after everyone left, I stayed behind to turn off the lights. The office was quiet, except for the hum of the heater and the faint echo of laughter that still lingered in the air. I stood by the window overlooking the city. The streets below glowed in soft lines of gold and red, and I realized that the company wasn't the only thing I'd saved. I had saved the part of myself that refused to settle for silence. Life didn't return to what it was before nothing ever does, but it found its own kind of balance. Owen's proposal had been the start of something gentle, a life that wasn't built around fear or proving myself. We spent weekends visiting his family, planning small trips, and talking about someday starting our own. Every so often I still received letters from old employees or clients, handwritten notes that began with "Your father would be proud." I kept them all in a wooden box in the office, the same one that used to hold my dad's contracts. Some mornings I'd open it, reread a few lines, and close it again, feeling like the weight of his absence had turned into something lighter. Looking back, it's strange how betrayal can clear the path for truth, how loss can pull you closer to what matters most. I used to think justice meant payback, but now I know it's something quieter. It's the peace that comes when the truth finally stands on its own. I didn't rebuild Bennett Properties to prove anything to my mother or to the world. I rebuilt it so that honesty, the thing my father valued above all else, would have a place to live. And in doing that, I found where I belonged. When the sun sets over Madison, now I still think about that night years ago, standing on the porch with rain soaking through my clothes, the door locked behind me. Back then, I thought that was the end of my story, but it was just the moment I learned how to begin again. If you've ever been pushed out, overlooked, or made to feel small, I hope you remember this. You don't have to wait for someone else to hand you peace. You can build it one choice at a time with your own two hands. And if this story stayed with you tonight, take a second to breathe, to reflect, and maybe to share it with someone who needs to hear that. Starting over doesn't mean you've lost. It just means you've decided to live honestly again.